Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper and today I'd like to tell you the story of, well, Christmas. The Nativity scene. A scene, of course, that's very familiar, and you can see them in churches everywhere, in malls around Christmas, and maybe you have one at home as well. But I'd like to tell you about the representation of these scenes in art, and to tell you, of course, where they come from. Because that's not always completely clear. You see, the birth of Jesus is, of course, mentioned in the Bible, but not that much. Only 2 of the 4 Gospels talk about it at all, only Matthew and Luke, and only Luke at any kind of length. And it's pretty brief, and many of the details that you find in your standard nativity scene are not mentioned in the Bible at all. So they're based on traditions, and I'll go through the nativity scene with you and show you a number of the very good ones that you can find in the world, and simply tell you which bits and pieces are in the Bible and which are not. Now, this one that you can see here is a scene from by Giotto. It's in the Scrovegni chapel in Padua, and it was finished around about 1305. If you're ever in Italy, go there, don't miss it. Padua, well, if you're going to visit Florence and Venice, and you take a train between the two, there's a stop in Padua. It's only 10 minutes from the station on foot, so it's very easy to get to. You have to book online in advance though, because otherwise you won't get in. Inside the church there's this series of images that describes the life of Mary, pretty much. And of course, a large part of her life is the life of Jesus as well. And obviously, as part of that series, there's a scene of the Nativity. But nativities, you didn't find them much in art before that time. Actually, there's a theory that the first nativity scenes as we know them, with little figurines that you place together during the celebration of Christmas, was fairly young at that time. There's a theory that it was started by Saint Francis of Assisi, and he lived in the 13th century, and maybe he didn't invent the custom, but he certainly popularized it. And it's very much part of the sort of thing that Franciscans did at the time, and I think still do, is bringing the more human sides of the stories directly to the people, so the more relatable scenes. Because the focus of earlier Christianity had usually been on the resurrection. Easter was celebrated much more than Christmas. Because of course Easter, the resurrection, is the big miracle, and everyone gets born. It's not much of a miracle. Let me rephrase that, or my wife will kill me. Of course, every birth of every human being is a huge miracle, but it's a fairly common one. So you didn't really see nativities in art that much. They're fairly rare. This is a very old one, maybe the oldest one still in existence, and it's 4th century. It's in Milan, and it's on a sarcophagus. And you see baby Jesus, but not much of a scene beyond that. What you do see, by the way, is an ox and an ass, or a donkey. That's one of the standardized bits. In any nativity scene, I'm sure you'll agree, there has to be an ox and a donkey. I say an ox, you can rarely determine the gender of the animal, so it could just as well be a cow, but you usually say an ox. And that's strange because they're not mentioned in the Gospels. Nowhere is it said that there's an ox and an ass nearby. There is, however, an Old Testament verse by Isaiah where it says, "The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib." And that verse is linked to the Nativity, and it's one of the reasons you find an ox and an ass there pretty much always. And it often happens that these things become a tradition, mostly if you can explain them in more than one way that fits nicely. And that's the case with the ox and the ass. The other explanation is there's a sort of a logic to their presence. One is, of course, well, there's a donkey, and they have traveled to get to Bethlehem. So they probably had a donkey to travel on. So basically, it would be their donkey. And the ox, well, that's slightly more difficult, but the most detailed description of the Nativity, of the birth of Jesus, you can find in Luke. And Luke is represented by a mystical beast. All the four evangelists have a beast, have an animal, sort of a miraculous animal attached to them that represents them symbolically. And his is an ox. So it also shows us Luke's involvement in all of this. By the way, Luke specifically says he wasn't there. He simply describes what he has heard. So that's a second explanation for the presence of these two animals. Both are true at the same time. That's the thing, and you find that in Christian painting a lot, that there's more layers of symbolism that all fit to the same story. Now there's a number of things in the narratives of both Luke and Mathew that are conspicuously missing. Things that we all take for granted in a nativity scene, but are simply not mentioned in the Bible. One of those is the time of year. We have no idea of when Jesus was born. That is, not in what season, not on what date. It's simply not mentioned. There's not even a mention of temperature. There's no one says it's cold or hot or whatever. There's simply nothing about the time of year. And it's, of course, well documented that it took until the 4th century before the birth of Christ was decided to be celebrated on the 25th of December. The reason for that is that it was a very popular feast day. Many other gods were already celebrated on that day. There's the Saturnalia, there's the birth of both Apollo and Artemis, well, they were twins, and there's the birth of Dionysus as well, and of Mystras and many other gods. So you might wonder why this was such a popular time for these feasts. Well, it has everything to do with the winter equinox. And again, that fits the story of Jesus really well, and that's why they picked the 25th of December, because he's the new light of the world, and it gets darker and darker and darker until the 25th of December, and then it gets lighter again. Now you might think, hold on, the winter equinox is not on the 25th of December. I know, but it was at the time. We've simply adjusted the calendar a bit. Now, one of the things that's also not mentioned in the Bible, but we take for granted anyway, is the barn he was born in. It does say in Luke that there was no room in the inn or in the house, all depending on your translation, but that doesn't necessarily mean they went to a barn. There's actually two different traditions, one where we have a barn or some sort of very simple dwelling, and another where they go to a cave. Actually, in the Orthodox tradition, the cave is more prevalent. This is a 14th century depiction of the Nativity. You can find this in Mystras in Greece, and here you can clearly see they're in a cave. Of course, many of the other elements are there as well. You can see Jesus lying there, Mary sort of recovering, I suppose, from giving birth, and in the background you can see the ox and the ass. There's also a whole bunch of angels floating around, and they're off, of course, to tell the shepherds about the whole thing. Now, if I take you back to this one by Giotto, here you can see Mary has given birth. They've wrapped the baby up in cloth and whatever they had, and they're now putting it in the manger. The Bible does mention the manger, but it says in Luke that they have to get one, and one is brought in. That sort of tells us they're in a house and someone gets a manger to put the baby in because they don't have a proper crib for the baby because they're improvising. And a manger can have, of course, a sort of right shape and size. But from it we have collectively deduced that they are in some sort of a barn. And in Giotto you can actually see there's sort of a combination between cave and barn. And you can also see here that the shepherds have arrived. They're of course being called by the angels. The angels are still calling them. And in the actual story, in Luke again, They go to these shepherds, and the shepherds are woken up, which is the only thing that tells us actually that all of this is happening at night. And they have to go and find the baby. And they go look for it. And that's an indication that they're not in the town. They're outside the town of Bethlehem. Because shepherds, of course, would stay with their flock outside of the city walls. And they couldn't go into the city at night. And of course, outside the city, shepherds are the only people that are available to come and adore the child. That makes it sort of a more logical sort of thing that they're in a barn or in a temporary sort of shelter or even a cave. What you see here, obviously, there's the ox, there's the donkey, there's shepherds here, there's some sheep, otherwise we wouldn't know they're shepherds. But we also see a woman helping Mary, a midwife. She's not mentioned in the Bible at all. That's simply a later tradition. Probably Giotto or someone else thought, well, Mary wouldn't be doing all of this by herself, would she? It's an invention probably by the artist in this case. But note that in this case that Joseph is asleep. He probably feels as useless as most dads do during childbirth. But there's an explanation for it, and I'll get back to you on that one. I have this wonderful little nativity scene as well here, an adoration of the shepherds. This one is by Bronzino, and I love this one because the shepherds are so cute. You can see here, of course, the baby, Mary, who has obviously recovered very quickly. It's not just any old birth. There's some sort of a midwife there as well. Joseph is here as well, in this case wide awake, and we have the shepherds who adore the child. In the background you can also see there's one angel still looking for more shepherds, I suppose. Now in this case, what I really like about it, the shepherds, they don't know how to behave. There's one that wants to play his bagpipes. Another one who immediately stops him because of course that would be very, very inappropriate with a very young child around. They've also brought some gifts. One brought a lamb, which of course is the right thing to have there because he's the Lamb of God, and that's sort of a reference to that. But the other one, the one here in front, has brought some exotic new, well, fruit, I suppose. He brought a basket of potatoes, which would be historically odd because potato had only just been introduced from the Americas just before this painting was made, well, a decade or so before. But it's also a more simple gift than the three wise men would bring later on. Well, here's another one. This one by Rogier van der Weyden. It's called the Middelburg Altarpiece. And the central part of that is this simple nativity scene. The man on the side, by the way, is the donor. He's the guy who paid for it. He has nothing to do with the story. What they've done here is they've placed this sort of ruin of a building just outside of the city of Bethlehem, which you can often see in nativity scenes as well, that they're outside a city, just outside the walls. As I mentioned, that's the place where you could find the shepherds and all. And here, of course, you see this tiny little baby, Mary adoring her own child. Joseph has a little candle, which does two things. It tells us this is at night, because the color of the sky doesn't really give us much of a hint. And he also lights up the child. He has the old light, and the child is the new light of the world. But one typical thing that you see here, and that became fashionable somewhere in the 15th century, is that they're not sitting in any old barn, they're sitting in the ruin of a much more grand building. Can you see that the windows are those of a bigger stone building, and there's a column there, and in fact there's even a basement. You can see that in the lower end there's a basement with grills over it so that you don't fall in, and that's actually mentioned in the Bible. It is said that the Messiah comes from the house of David. Now, obviously in the Bible they mean he comes from the family of David, in the family line of King David. And that's the reason they had to go to Bethlehem. Remember, they had to go to Bethlehem. They came from Nazareth and had to travel all the way to Bethlehem because of a census. By the way, that's not an historical thing. They didn't do that. The Romans held censuses once in a while, every, I don't know, 7 years, I think. But they didn't require people to go to the towns of their ancestors, because when you count people, you don't want them to travel. You want them to stay where they are. It's much easier to count them that way. But of course, he has to come from the house of David. It's more a metaphor of him being a relative, a descendant of David. But during the 15th century, it became, well, fashionable for nativity scenes that the house they're in, the ruin that they're in, is the actual house of David. So this is supposed to be the ruin of the palace of David. And the basement that's made there is actually a reference to something that was popular in theology at the time, that the Old Testament was the foundation of the New Testament. And so the basement tells us there's a foundation below, and the New Testament that, well, begins here. Now those references to and fro within the whole biblical story, they are very popular within nativity scenes in art. You have to understand that they were actually used by preachers in their sermons. They would talk to people, they would tell them the various stories and the references that are all over the Bible, and therefore there's all these references to different parts of the Bible. In fact, you start to see that in these ruins of a palace, you find a very prominent column. And that column that you see here in front actually plays a role much later in the story, that is during the torture of Jesus, when he's tied to a column and beaten. So during the Passion. And this supposedly is that same column. That's what they would use it for in their sermons. So you see the baby and you see the Passion as well. What you also often see in art is that the baby sort of glows. And that too has a good reason. Of course, the birth is supposed to take place at night, and then you need a light source. And the baby giving light would be perfect, because he is the new light of the world, of course. That's what you're trying to say. But it became popular through a particular dream of a particular nun called Bridget of Sweden. She had a vision that she wrote about of the child itself glowing light. Well, it fits, of course, in the whole theology. And it became a popular story, and it was referenced to in many places. And that's why you can see this type of nativity scene where the only light source is the child itself. By the way, if you look really closely, you can see that Joseph is in the background as well. And of course, in the further background, beyond, you can see an angel. And that angel is announcing to the shepherds that they have to find the child. Now, in the Bible, I said there's two Gospels that talk about the birth of Jesus. There's Matthew and there's Luke. Luke is the one that's more elaborate about it. In the story of Luke, the shepherds come, they adore the child, and pretty soon they leave and they go to Jerusalem, and there the child gets this ritual cleansing, and then presumably they go home. There's a different story in Matthew though. In Matthew, they are in Bethlehem, the child is born, and then there's these wise men that are looking for the child. We know them as the three wise men, but actually in the Bible there's no number mentioned. There's no names to them either. I know that these days in several churches they've gotten names, but they don't have them in the Bible. Now these three wise men, they then go in search of the child, but they visit Herod first, King Herod, and he hears from them that the King of Kings is born, or is about to be born. And when they leave, King Herod then decides to try and kill him. That ends in a massacre in Bethlehem. And of course, Jesus and his parents fleeing to Egypt. But these wise men then follow a star, and that leads them to find the Holy Family and of course the newborn child. And there they give him three gifts. the gifts of gold, myrrh and incense. That's the reason we think there's 3 of them, because there's 3 gifts. You don't expect wise men to come up empty-handed. Nothing more of these wise men or magi, or sometimes kings, is known. Nothing more is mentioned about them, but we've made them into these 3 figures that offer their gifts, and they've also often, but not always, been given a very specific look. One is that they're of different ages. There's an old one, there's a middle-aged one, and there's a younger one. That's the 3 ages of man, you might say. But often they're also very distinctive in their look, that there's one old white man, one middle-aged man with a turban, and one African man. Now they represent the 3 continents. Of course, they only knew 3 continents at the time. The old man is Europe, known to be the old world. This, of course, from the viewpoint of Europeans, because this is Northern European art. Then the middle-aged man with a turban is Asia, because, again, to Europeans, Asia was represented by the Turks. And they were supposed to wear turbans in the eyes of Northern Europeans. And of course the African man is Africa. He's black and he's also the youngest man. And of course sometimes they wear crowns, sometimes they don't. And in this one by Geertgen tot St. Jans, you can actually see in the background that they're coming together. There's 3 different groups coming from 3 different sides. Each of them coming from a different continent, coming together to adore the child. So the entire world adores the child. That's the point. That's the reason they do it that way. And in some cases, that's kind of rare, you can see that in later versions in 17th or 18th century, that they've added a few more wise men in the background to add more continents. And of course here in the background you see the ox and the ass. They're not interested in this scene anymore. They've already adored the child. They're just going off to have some food. Now here's an Italian one. This one is by Botticelli. He made sure we can see that this is a ruin of a much bigger palace, because there's more ruin in the background as well. Now the fashion of making this the ruin of a palace came from the north, came from Flanders, but was used in the south as well after a while. It was simply copied, even though in this case Botticelli really tried to make it both a barn and a cave. In this case there's actually a self-portrait. We think it's a self-portrait of Botticelli on the side. Now one of the typical things you see here for Florence of that period is that there's a large group of people and all of them are portraits. The man who ordered the painting is over here. It was made for his chapel, and he really tries to tell us that he is a supporter of the Medici family, because most of the other prominent people here are portraits of the Medici. First and foremost, the 3 wise men are all Medici. The oldest one is called Cosimo il Vecchio, which means Cosimo the Elder, which is sort of the founding father of the Medici. He's the first one to become really, really prominent. And then there's various other generations standing and sitting around. Now, note that in this case, in the background, we see again Joseph, and he's asleep. We've seen that before, and actually in art you see it all the time. Specifically in the case of the Adoration of the Magi or the Adoration of the Kings. And that's because it says so in Mathew. There's a number of times when Joseph receives warnings, messages from an angel in his dreams. And he is told in his dreams that there's a danger, that they're going to be attacked, and that Herod is going to try and kill the child, and they have to flee to Egypt. That, of course, is part of the storyline of the 3 wise men, so that is why he's asleep. This is another one by Rogier van der Weyden, and here you can see them, of course, sitting in the ruins of a much bigger building. They're outside the city of Bethlehem, that in this case resembles a Flemish city pretty much. And there's the ox, there's the ass, there's the 3 wise men or kings, and in this case there's not an African one, but they are the 3 ages of man. There's one younger one, there's a middle-aged man, and there's an older man. And As I mentioned before, they love to add references to the end of the story, that is, to the Passion. In this case, they did that very literally. You see, just above the child and Mary, you can see in the background a crucifixion, just like the ones people would have on their walls probably. But I can assure you that during the time of the birth of Jesus, you couldn't buy a crucifixion yet. But it's just the sort of thing they like to do in these paintings. Now, I hope I've given you some things to talk about around the Christmas dinner table. And of course, if you like this video, give me a like, subscribe if you haven't already. And I'd like to wish you a very Merry Christmas and of course a Happy New Year. Thanks for watching. Bye.